George Gobel walked onto the Tonight Show stage on March 6, 1969, carrying a plastic cup filled with what he claimed was water. Nobody believed him. Not the audience, not Johnny Carson, and certainly not Bob Hope and Dean Martin, who were already sitting on the couch, 3 sheets to the wind themselves. What happened over the next 15 minutes became the most replayed Tonight Show segment in history, not because of brilliant jokes or planned comedy bits, but because Johnny Carson completely lost control of his own show, and it was glorious. The setup was supposed to be simple. It was one of Johnny's anniversary week specials, where he brought out multiple legendary guests throughout the evening. Bob Hope had been the first guest, America's comedian, sharp as ever at 65 years old, trading barbs with Johnny like they'd been doing for decades. Then Dean Martin sauntered out, cigarette in one hand, drink in the other, doing his famous lovable drunk routine that had made him one of the biggest stars in entertainment. Dean wasn't really drunk, or at least that was the official story. His daughter would later insist that the whole drunk act was just that, an act. But on this particular night in March 1969, the line between Dean Martin, the character, and Dean Martin, the man, was impossible to find. He was loose, funny, and clearly enjoyed himself in ways that suggested his glass contained more than apple juice. Bob Hope and Dean Martin together were already chaos. 2 giants of comedy, both old enough to not care about television protocols, both confident enough to riff and interrupt and ignore whatever producers had planned. Johnny was doing his best to maintain some structure, but you could see it slipping. The audience loved it. This wasn't scripted Tonight Show banter. This was real, unpredictable live television. Then George Gobel was introduced. George Gobel was 50 years old in 1969, and his career was in an interesting place. He'd been huge in the 1950s with his own show, The George Gobel Show, which had won him an Emmy and made him a household name. His comedy style was the opposite of Bob Hope's rapid-fire wit or Dean Martin's cool swagger. George was quiet, homespun, almost shy. His humor came from his delivery, hesitant, self-deprecating, the kind of guy who seemed perpetually confused by his own success. By 1969, though, George wasn't the star he'd once been. His show had been canceled. He was doing guest spots, game shows, trying to stay relevant in an entertainment landscape that had moved on to younger, hipper comedians. Being invited onto Johnny's anniversary show with Bob Hope and Dean Martin should have been an honor, a chance to remind America that George Gobel still had it. Instead, it became the night George Gobel became a legend for entirely different reasons. He walked onto the stage carrying that plastic cup, and you could tell immediately that something was off. Not falling down drunk, not slurring or stumbling, but loose, relaxed in a way that suggested he'd spent some quality time in his dressing room preparing for this moment. His eyes had that slightly glassy look. His smile was a bit too wide. And when he sat down on the couch next to Dean Martin, he set that plastic cup down on the coffee table with the exaggerated care of someone who knew he needed to be careful. Johnny welcomed him warmly. George Gobel, ladies and gentlemen. The audience applauded. George waved, looking around like he wasn't quite sure how he'd gotten there. "George, great to have you here," Johnny said. "You know Bob Hope and Dean Martin, of course." "Oh, sure," George said, his Midwestern accent thick. "I know these guys. I've known these guys for years." Dean Martin, sensing fresh meat, leaned over with his cigarette dangling from his lips. "George, what are you drinking there?" "Water," George said, completely straight-faced. Dean looked at the camera. "Water?" "Sure. And I'm drinking milk." The audience laughed. George smiled that confused smile. That was his trademark. And that's when Dean Martin had an idea. Dean had a cigarette going. He always had a cigarette going. And as George turned to answer one of Johnny's questions, Dean casually, deliberately tapped the cigarette ash directly into George's plastic cup. The audience saw it immediately. 300 people in the studio suddenly had the same thought. "Oh my God, he didn't." A woman in the front row gasped audibly. The cameraman zoomed in slightly on the cup, making sure America saw what was happening. Johnny saw it, too. His eyes widened, and he bit his lip, trying not to laugh. He looked at the director in the booth, who was probably having a heart attack, trying to figure out if they should cut away. Bob Hope, sitting on the other end of the couch, nearly fell over. He grabbed Johnny's desk for support, his face turning red from suppressed laughter. But George had no idea. He was too focused on talking to Johnny, telling some story about his time in World War II, oblivious to the fact that his drink was now 30% cigarette ash. He was gesturing with his hands, animated in that understated George Gobel way, completely invested in his own story, while Dean Martin systematically destroyed any chance George had of taking another sip. Ed McMahon, sitting at his announcer's desk off to the side, was shaking. His shoulders were bouncing up and down with silent laughter. Doc Severson and the band members were looking at each other with expressions that said, "Are you seeing this?" The whole studio had become complicit in Dean's prank, everyone watching in real time as this beautiful act of comedic sabotage unfolded. Johnny tried to continue the interview, but he kept glancing at the cup, then at Dean, then back at George. Dean, meanwhile, was playing it completely cool, occasionally taking another drag, and then tap, tap, more ash into George's cup. The audience was losing it, not loud laughter. They were trying to stay quiet so George wouldn't notice, but that suppressed gasping kind of laughter where people are trying so hard not to make noise that it makes it funnier. Johnny asked George about his war service. George launched into his famous bit about serving as a flight instructor in Oklahoma during World War II. "You know, Johnny," George said with complete sincerity, "not one Japanese plane got past Tulsa while I was on duty." The audience erupted. It was a great line, one George had used before, but the delivery was perfect. That combination of pride and obliviousness that made George Gobel so funny. Dean took another drag. Tap, tap, more ash in the cup. At this point, Johnny was barely holding it together. He was trying to ask questions, but every time he looked at that cup, he started laughing. Bob Hope was wiping tears from his eyes. Dean Martin was a picture of innocence, acting like he had no idea why everyone was laughing. And George, still no clue. He kept talking, kept gesturing, kept being George Gobel. At one point, he reached for his cup. The audience gasped, but then he put it back down without drinking. Crisis averted. Then came the moment that made this segment immortal. George had been talking for maybe 5 minutes, telling stories, getting laughs, doing his thing, but you could see it dawning on him that something was happening that he wasn't part of. The audience was laughing at things that weren't his jokes. Johnny kept looking at something. Bob and Dean were exchanging glances. George paused, looked around, tried to figure out what was going on. And in that moment of confusion, he turned to Johnny and said with perfect timing and absolutely no awareness of how profound it was, "Did you ever get the feeling that the world was a tuxedo and you were a pair of brown shoes?" The studio exploded. Not polite laughter, not even the loud laughter. This was complete, uncontrolled hysteria. Bob Hope bent over double, actually slapping his knee like a cartoon character. Dean Martin threw his head back and let out that signature laugh of his, the real one, not the practice one. Johnny Carson laughed so hard he had to put his face in his hands. He was wiping tears from his eyes, unable to look at George because every time he did, he'd start laughing again. The audience was screaming, applauding, some people standing up because they couldn't contain themselves sitting down. The line was perfect, not just funny, profound. It captured everything about that moment. Here was George Gobel, a good comedian, but not a superstar, sitting between Bob Hope and Dean Martin, two of the biggest names in entertainment history, while his drink was being used as an ashtray, and he had no idea. Of course, he felt like a pair of brown shoes in a tuxedo world. But more than that, the line captured something universal. Everyone watching at home understood that feeling. The secretary who felt out of place at the company Christmas party, the kid from the small town who moved to the big city, the person who always felt like they didn't quite fit in with the cool crowd. George Gobel had just given voice to a feeling that millions of people carried with them every day. The applause went on for almost 30 seconds. In television time, that's an eternity. Johnny finally pulled himself together enough to speak, but his voice was still shaking with laughter. Johnny tried to recover. He was laughing so hard he could barely speak. "George, that's beautiful. That's perfect." George smiled, pleased that he'd gotten such a big laugh. still completely unaware that Dean had been ashing in his drink for the last 5 minutes. But Johnny couldn't let it go. He looked at the cup, looked at Dean, looked at the audience who were all waiting to see if George would ever figure it out. And then Johnny said the other line that made this segment legendary. Exactly what time did I lose control of this show? More laughter, because it was true. The show had descended into beautiful chaos. There was no script anymore, no plan, just 3 drunk or drunk acting legends and 1 confused comedian. And somehow it was the best television anyone had made all year. George finally noticed people looking at his cup. He picked it up, peered into it, and saw the layer of ash floating on top of what had once been water. His face went through about 5 different expressions: confusion, realization, resignation, and finally amusement. Dean, he said, shaking his head. You son of a gun. Dean shrugged, took another drag of the cigarette, and blew smoke toward the ceiling. What? I didn't do nothing. The segment continued for a few more minutes, but nothing could top those moments. The brown shoes line, Johnny's loss of control, the cigarette ash reveal. It was lightning in a bottle, the kind of genuine, unscripted moment that made live television magical. After the show, George Gobel became famous for that line. It followed him for the rest of his career. People would quote it back to him everywhere he went. Hey, George, feeling like a pair of brown shoes today? He always smiled and nodded. He knew it was the moment that had rescued his career from obscurity. The Tonight Show segment was replayed constantly. Whenever Carson did anniversary shows or clip compilations, the brown shoes moment was always included. It became shorthand for feeling out of place, for being the odd one out, for that universal experience of not quite fitting in with the cool kids. Years later, when George Gobel died in 1991, his obituary in the New York Times led with the brown shoes, quote, not his Emmy, not his 1950s TV show, the line he'd improvised while drunk on Johnny Carson's couch, while Dean Martin used his drink as an ashtray. Dean Martin never apologized for the prank. Why would he? It was funny. George never seemed to mind. He understood that sometimes your best moment comes when you're not trying to have your best moment. When you're just being yourself, confused and slightly drunk, try to figure out why everyone's laughing. Bob Hope later said it was one of his favorite Tonight Show appearances, even though he'd barely done anything. I just sat there and watched George be George. Hope said, sometimes that's all you need to do. Johnny Carson always listed it as one of his top 10 Tonight Show moments. Not the carefully planned bits with Joan Rivers or Steve Martin. Not the celebrity interviews or the big musical numbers. A drunk comedian feeling out of place and accidentally creating poetry. The March 6, 1969 episode became one of the most requested tapes in the Tonight Show archives. People wanted to show it to their friends to prove that television used to be this spontaneous, this real, this unpredictably brilliant. In 2007, 16 years after George Gobel died, scientists discovered a rare Galapagos tortoise that had been living alone on an island for decades. They needed a name for him. They called him Lonesome George after George Gobel because he too was a little out of place, a little behind the times. A pair of brown shoes in a world of tuxedos. The line has lasted longer than any joke Bob Hope told that night. Longer than any Dean Martin song. It lasted because it was true. Because everyone at some point in their life has felt exactly like George Gobel felt on March 6, 1969. Like they don't quite belong. Like everyone else is wearing tuxedos, and they showed up in brown shoes. And somehow admitting that feeling, giving it words, making people laugh about it while slightly drunk and unaware that your drink is full of cigarette ash, that became immortal. If this story of legendary comedians, cigarette ash pranks, and the most perfect improvised line in Tonight Show history made you laugh, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever felt like a pair of brown shoes. Have you ever had a moment where you accidentally said something profound? Share your story in the comments and hit that notification bell for more true stories about the nights when live television became comedy gold.